As you probably know, can you hear me okay? It's okay? Good. So as you probably know, the title of the lectures is Varieties of Skepticism. And there'll be 3 lectures. So in the first lecture, what I'm going to be doing is offering a partial taxonomy of various sorts of things that you might call, that people have called skepticism, philosophical skepticism, and also a taxonomy of various sorts of response that these skepticisms have engendered. And then what I'm going to try to show, especially in the second and third lectures, is that the aim of this taxonomic exercise is to provide you with a helpful overview. Wittgenstein might have said, a perspicuous representation, übersichtliche Darstellung, of the various sorts of dialectical relations that obtain among these various sorts of things that philosophers have called skepticism. So our starting question might be, why are all the things that are called skepticism called by the same name? So one possibility is that this unity among the things that are called skepticism is a merely nominal unity. It's the same word, but they're actually completely different. Another possibility is that there's a real philosophical unity. There's some connection, some inner unity to these different things that get called skepticism. And that's the question I want to explore, or begin to explore in these 3 lectures. I think to do this completely would take more than 3 lectures. But in 3 lectures, I think we can already take some big steps. And I'm going to argue that if we have such a perspicuous representation of the various sorts of things that one calls skepticism, that, first of all, that this can afford various forms of philosophical insight. I'll mention in particular as we go along 4 kinds of insight that I think will come from this overview. And secondly, I want to argue, but in the third lecture I will only really be able to suggest, because to argue this is a large job, but I will suggest strongly that it is not a merely nominal unity, that there's a real philosophical unity to the various things called skepticism. So that's the aim of the 3 lectures. And the first lecture will basically be to introduce this partial taxonomy. So in today's lecture, I'll be introducing you to 2 varieties of skepticism. What I actually think is that one needs to distinguish between at least 4 varieties to have a good overview. But already just to distinguish 2 carefully is difficult, as you'll see. So that will be our aim today, is to introduce you to this partial taxonomy. Tomorrow's lecture, on Tuesday, what I'll do is really try to explain these 2 varieties. And then in the third lecture, I will try to apply the taxonomy and show you the kinds of insight it can give you. So very briefly, the 3 lectures then are today introduction, tomorrow explanation, Wednesday application. So the 2 varieties of skepticism that I will say flow from this initial distinction I will call Cartesian skepticism and Kantian skepticism, respectively. Now, already, I will interrupt myself to say, these labels, Cartesian and Kantian, they're contentious labels. I choose them with some conscious mischief. It won't necessarily be obvious at first why I choose these labels. Eventually, I will say some words in explanation. But to begin with, I think I will intentionally not say too much in explanation. But I would also like to say, before I go any further, that nothing of substance from my lectures, very little of substance from my lectures, hangs on the labels. If you don't like the labels, if you think, he shouldn't call that Cartesian skepticism, don't call that Kantian skepticism, then fine, change the label. Skepticism 1, skepticism 2. The important thing is there is a distinction to be drawn that captures things that philosophers talk about. Attaching the labels to the names of historical figures, for reasons we will see, is actually quite complicated matter, because the skepticisms themselves evolve to the pressure of philosophical thinking. So saying this skepticism is present in that thinker is a complicated matter. So other labels might serve equally well to mark the distinctions I want to draw attention to. What matters for me is the distinctions themselves. Now, some more terminology. Today, the first lecture, I apologize, will mostly be terminology. I will introduce you to an enormous apparatus. And then I will start explaining the apparatus tomorrow, and then we will use it on Wednesday. So you have to have some patience. This is really introduction, as I said. If you can only come to the first lecture, then you might want to leave, because you'll have no benefit at all, I think. Each of the first bit of terminology is quite straightforward. I want to distinguish between a Cartesian question and a Kantian question. So each of these varieties of skepticism has its origin, I will say, in a philosophical question or a philosophical worry. And one way of distinguishing the varieties is to distinguish carefully how the shape of the questions differ. So to begin with today, I may be giving you the impression for a while that the differences between these varieties of skepticism is so great that there really is only a nominal unity. Why call this skepticism and that skepticism? My aim in a way today is to make you feel that the unity might be merely nominal. Eventually I want to undo this impression. But first I want you to feel the possibility that it's not obvious at first exactly how to explain the interconnection. So that means partly I want you to see how the Cartesian question and the Cartesian worry and the Kantian worry are quite different, at least in inception. And each of these questions, if you push them, if you follow the Cartesian question, you follow the Kantian question, you come to a moment in which you are faced with a philosophical predicament or paradox. I think the word predicament is actually slightly better for the Cartesian case, and paradox is slightly better for the Kantian case. I can't find a word that has quite the right generality, but so let's say predicament / paradox. So first we have two questions, the Cartesian and Kantian question, then we have two different predicaments or paradoxes, the Cartesian one and the Kantian one. And then we have a possible kind of figure, a figure who acquiesces in the paradox, who says, yes, we must accept this predicament. This is an imaginary figure. The person who accepts the Cartesian paradox I will call a Cartesian skeptic. And the person who acquiesces in the Kantian paradox, this is an even more imaginary figure, for reasons we will see. I will call a Kantian skeptic. And it's not that philosophy is full of people who are such skeptics. What the history of philosophy is full of is people who are arguing with these imaginary figures. First the Cartesian skeptic, and then the Kantian skeptic. Arguing with them. That is, the customary response to each of the paradoxes is to seek a way to get out of them, to entitle oneself philosophically to do something other than acquiesce, accept the paradoxical conclusion. Somehow, by refuting it, by dissolving it, diagnosing it, doing something to it. So what I'm interested in is the enormous raft of philosophy that issues, in each case from the responses to each of these skeptics. I don't mean to suggest that there's just one kind of response. There's enormous diversity of response to each of these kinds of skeptic. And this is what I'm really interested in. So these varieties of interlocking systems of responses that flow from the attempts to address each of these sorts of skeptics, I will call the Cartesian problematic and the Kantian problematic, respectively. These give rise, if you will, to a kind of philosophical space. And it's these problematics that I will primarily be concerned to address here, and that I'll be discussing and referring to as varieties of skepticism. So I'm using the word skepticism in an unusual way. That's the first thing to notice. I'm not using skepticism to denote a position, because there is almost no one who holds that position in either case. I'm using the word skepticism to denote each of these problematics that flow from the attempts to address the skeptic. So, Skepticism is a name for a problematic. And many of the people who occupy this problematics, they have a self-understanding of themselves as anti-skeptical philosophers. But if you are in the middle of this problematic, then you are located in, for me, what is a skeptical space. A space of what I'm going to call skepticism. So if I want to just talk about the skeptic himself, the person who occupies the supposed position, I will say the Cartesian or Kantian skeptic. If I'm just interested in the question, I will say the Cartesian question. I want to talk about the paradox, I will say the Kantian or the Cartesian skeptic paradox. But if I say skepticism, Cartesian and Kantian skepticism, then I mean the problematic. So I mean many, many philosophers, most of whom do not think of themselves as skeptics, and many of whom might not think of themselves as even interested in skepticism. But if I can show their position only makes sense in the wake of an attempt to address such a skeptic, then they are still located in one of these skeptical problematics. So I'm going to be using the words very generally. So I'm talking about a lot of philosophy. So just to explain the terminology, according to my unconventional idiom that we will be using for the next 3 days, the term skepticism and its variants, Cartesian skepticism, Kantian skepticism, and so on, refer not just to one or another sort of philosophical position held by one or another philosopher, who is properly called a skeptic, but rather to, as I put it, a dialectical space within which philosophers occupy a range of apparently opposed philosophical positions, positions that they might call things like realism, idealism, coherentism, and so on. That is, they refer to the dialectical space in which these philosophers engage one another, while seeking, at least implicitly and often explicitly, a stable way to answer the skeptic's question or worry in the affirmative, saying, yes, we can have knowledge, for instance, rather than in the negative, as the skeptic himself does. So, according to the terminology I'm using, a philosopher can be concerned with the Cartesian skeptical problematic without himself being a Cartesian skeptic. And of course, Descartes himself was such a philosopher. And the same holds for the relation between being concerned with the Kantian skeptical problematic, being a Kantian skeptic, and being Kant. So now, you have a handout. And the first thing in your handout is 2 quotations. I won't actually read the quotations, but they give you instances of a famous moment in Descartes and a famous moment in Kant, each of which I will eventually try to show you, epitomizes each of these philosophical problematics. The moment from Descartes is a famous moment from the first meditation. It's the moment where he imagines he might be dreaming. So in Descartes, he's sitting in front of the fireplace in his dressing gown, but he asks himself, do I know I'm sitting in front of the fireplace in my dressing gown? And he occurs to him one possibility is that he might be dreaming. If he were dreaming, and it was a very convincing dream, some dreams are convincing, he says, there would be, as he puts it in this quotation, no marks or features by means of which I could distinguish being awake from being asleep. So, if that were the case, although it would seem to him that he is standing in front, or sitting in front of the fireplace in his dressing gown, he would actually be lying in bed, undressed. So this has the structure of what I'm going to call a Cartesian problematic. We will talk about the features of such a problematic in more detail eventually. But it's enough for now just to notice some things about it. There's a question about knowledge. Do I know? And it's followed by a doubt. But what if? There's a claim to know, but the doubt says, but maybe I don't know. And the doubt has a structure. The structure of the doubt in the Cartesian problematic always turns on what you might call a problem of indistinguishability. So, for instance, it seems to me like I'm lecturing to some people in Naples. But I have jet lag. I just came from America yesterday. I'm extremely tired. I can't remember what was yesterday and what was the day before yesterday. I haven't slept. And maybe I'm back in my hotel, and I'm asleep, and I'm imagining I'm lecturing, fulfilling the wish to lecture without having to get out of bed, finally get some sleep. So, if I was having such a dream, that situation would be indistinguishable from the present situation. Can I rule out that I'm actually in the non-veridical situation, the situation that's a ringer for the situation I want to be in? But there are, as Descartes puts it, no internal marks or features that distinguishes this situation from that non-veridical situation. And if I can't rule it out, then even if it's true that I'm lecturing at the Instituto, even if it's 99.9% sure I'm lecturing at the Instituto, if I can't rule out the possibility that my situation is the one that is subjectively indistinguishable from that one, then I don't know. I cannot claim to know. That is always the structure of the Cartesian problematic. We'll explore it in more detail. The Kantian problematic is harder to understand. But in the Kant passage, you have the idea that experience has a certain kind of unity. Both how things are and how things seem, even to seem to be a certain way. For it to seem to me to be the case that I'm lecturing at the Instituto, it still must have a certain structure or organization. And the worry is then, what if these conditions of unity did not obtain? We cannot make sense of the possibility that a cognitive being could have experiences of this form. What then? The end of this passage from Kant, quotation 2, he says, without this thoroughgoing universal unity of consciousness, if this were not met in the manifold of perceptions, then these perceptions would not then belong to any experience. If these conditions were not met, I would not have something we could call experience. Consequently, they would be without an object, merely a blind play of representations, ein blindes Spiel der Vorstellung, a blind one after another of things presented to me. And the passage ends, he says, less even than a dream. So, just talking about these two quotations, the first one, the second one, we can say this to begin with. The problematic of the first two passages centers on how to distinguish between dreaming that one's experiencing something and actually experiencing. How do you draw that line? The problematic of the second passage asks, what does it take so much as to be able to dream that one is experiencing something? The unity that the experience of dreaming and the veridical experience of being in the Instituto have in common, and something less even than that, less than a dream. So we can already notice this much as we move from the Descartes passage to the Kant passage. The second of these two problematics focuses on the conditions of the possibility of something that the first takes for granted. That we can dream. That Descartes takes for granted. Or more generally, that our experience has a certain shape or form. That as a res cogitans, I can have thoughts, doubts, experiences. This is something that is simply self-intimating. There's no room for doubt. That, I think, is Descartes' most famous and important example of something I cannot doubt. Doubt is not possible here. Whereas Kant's question asks, how is that possible? That which we're taking for granted. So we might put it this way. In Descartes, we have the realm of res cogitans, and then we want to know, how do we know that within res extensa things are as they seem to us, qua res cogitans? For Kant, the question is, how could res cogitans itself be structured in such a way that is about res extensa? Truly or falsely? How could there even be that relation of aboutness or intention or denotation from here to there? Now, how should we put this difference? I've just begun with two passages to show you something to think about. But now, how do we want to really characterize the difference here? Well, here's a very familiar way of characterizing the contrast. You can say the first passage is concerned with knowledge, and the second passage is concerned with the conditions of knowledge. So you're often, maybe, if you read books on the history of philosophy, told something like this. Descartes wants to arrive at knowledge. Kant wants to arrive at the ground of the possibility of knowledge. And my question today is, but what does that mean? It's not that Descartes is uninterested in the possibility of knowledge, exactly. It's not that Kant isn't interested in knowledge. So what does this difference really come to? And there's many ways to put that difference. There's many ways to unpack that contrast. And so what I'll do next is I'll indicate three ways, quickly, of unpacking the contrast. I suppose partly in an effort to confuse you slightly. But really, what I think, and I will tell you this now so you don't become too confused, but what I really think is that these different ways of unpacking the contrast, at bottom, are really the same thing, really come to the same difference. And it's this difference we first need to understand, to see at least on the surface how apparently distinct Cartesian and Kantian skepticism are in their, shall we call it, superficial logic, or their superficial appearance. So here's a first way to put the contrast between the Cartesian problematic and the Kantian problematic. We can put it as a contrast between a concern with actuality and a concern with possibility. That's, I think, the one that's most to the surface of what I just said. So let's say something like this. Cartesian skepticism takes the possibility of experience for granted. That experience is possible, we may assume that. We can dream. We can doubt. Its question has to do with actuality. How do I know that things really are as they appear to me? Or how do I know I'm not dreaming? So something like the word real tends to, or some substitute for the word real or actual, is almost inevitably in play in a formulation of Cartesian skepticism. Later on I will give you marks of features of Cartesian skepticism. This is one of the basic marks, is that some moment the philosopher pounds the table and he says, but can I really be, are things really as they seem, might be the most general way to put this. Kantian skepticism, on the other hand, brings, if you will, within its scope, the scope of its worry, that which the Cartesian takes for granted. That experience possesses the requisite unity to so much as be about something. That my mind could have the power to represent something outside my mind, how things are in the world, people in a room, in such and such a way. Hence, the importance of the word possible in Kantian formulations of the skeptical problematic. How is experience so much as possible? Some word like possible, or can so much as be the case? That's the moment at which the Kantian will tend to pound the table. It's not whether they use the word real or they use the word possible. They both use both words. It's the moment when the fist hits the table will be a different moment, depending upon the problematic. A second way of unpacking the contrast between the Cartesian and the Kantian problematic, what I'm calling Cartesian skepticism, Kantian skepticism. We might put it as a distinction between a worry about things being so and a worry about things being so. That is, Cartesian skepticism is always a worry about the veridicality of something. In the case we're talking about with the dreaming hypothesis in perception, it's a worry about the veridicality of our experience. Kantian skepticism calls into question not the veridicality of experience, but rather the intelligibility of the experience. How can there be something that has a form of intelligibility? So the Cartesian is concerned with the question, how can I know things are as they seem? That something with such and such a being ontologically, exists. Hence, the Cartesian problematic always focuses on an inferential step from appearance to reality. In the perception case, in the first meditation, from my mind to the world. Am I entitled to that inference? The worry in the Kantian problematic focuses on the conditions of the possibility of the kind of unity presupposed by the Cartesian in that argument. That is, on what the Cartesian seeks to infer from. The point of departure for the Cartesian inferential step is the thing in the focus of the worry of the person who is stuck in a Kantian problematic. So the Kantian asks, if you will, what sort of unity must characterize, in our example before, ein Spiel der Vorstellung, a play of representations, for it to be more than a merely blind play, for it to possess the aspect of offering appearances, for it to possess the character of being of an object. We're not interested now where the of is a genuine causal of, so there's an object there. We're interested in the of intentionality, that it can be representing an object, truly or falsely, that could be the content of the representation. So the worry in Kantian skepticism is from how we get from blindness to something that's not blind, that gives us a presentation, a vision, a picture of how things might be. Third way of unpacking the contrast. I said I would give you three. You can think of the distinction between the problematics as a distinction between one that is focused on a problem of truth and one that's focused on a problem of, now it's hard to put this. Kant has a word for it. He talks in this context of objektive Gültigkeit, objective validity. I will introduce some terminology. It's just we think of this as a problem of objective purport. So the Cartesian wants to know which of his thoughts are true, which of his experiences are veridical. We have lots of thoughts, we have lots of experiences. The Cartesian problem is now to sift. And the problem of Cartesian skepticism might be that the answer is 0. But whatever the number is, we want to go among these and sort out the true ones from the not true ones. So the Cartesian skeptic worries about a transition from a sensory experience to a judgment based on that sensory experience, if it's the perception case. If it's a different case, from what we might call a thought to its truth value. So the Cartesian problematic inquires always into what we might call the truth of things. Given that this is what we're inclined to judge, right now I'm inclined to judge that I'm lecturing in Naples, do we know that we judge truthfully in so judging? The Kantian skeptic, on the other hand, if he were to succeed, if the problem of the Kantian problematic were to become urgent, would deprive us of the resources for so much as being able to enjoy an experience, waking or dreaming, for so much as being able to frame a thought, true or false. So the Kantian problematic inquires into the ground of the possibility of being able to do these things, the ground of the possibility of various cognitive achievements. For example, being able to enjoy an experience, entertain a thought with such and such a determinate content. How is such determinacy achieved in one's experience of objects or one's thought about things? So the Kantian problematic is concerned, in the first instance, not with truth. The problem of falsity is just a problem for a Kantian. How can I so much as think something false? That's the same problem for a Kantian. So not with truth. He's concerned rather with what you might call what it is to stick your neck out in thinking. For your thought to be of such and such a shape, so that it's vulnerable to the world, even if you can't know the answer, that your thought itself has this power of it's mattering how things are in the world for the value of the thought. So Conant is concerned, and this is what I take him to mean by the objective validity, the objektive Gültigkeit, the judgment. You could think of it this way. He's concerned with how things can so much as be candidates for truth and falsehood, thoughts, experiences, so forth. And this is what I will call from now on, to have a clear word for this, the problem of the objective purport of judgment. That our experiences, our thoughts can have this purport, represent things a certain way, objectively. Now, just to wake you up a little bit, I'll make a big claim. Most of the big claims will be tomorrow and even more on Wednesday, but I thought I'd give you one today so you don't fall asleep. And so it's a coming attraction. First, I'll start just with a large empirical generalization. But it's already interesting, I think. It takes quite some work to test it. Here's my empirical generalization. In any area of philosophy in which you can find one of these two varieties of skepticism, if you look, you can usually find the other. That's a large claim. It takes quite a bit of work to test that. If you want today in the discussion, you can start to test me on this. What about philosophy of mind? What about ethics? What about philosophy of science? What about philosophy of law? We can try it. It's a big claim. That's the first claim. And in saying that, I want to be clear. I'm not in any way denying that in some area of philosophy, one of these problematics might be more important, whatever that means. That it might have come to seem to be more gripping or otherwise more deserving of interest. The claim is just where you can find one, you can find the other, generally. But here's a stronger claim. This is the more interesting claim. I want to say, and ultimately I hope to sort of show, that wherever one of these sorts of skepticism is possible, the other is possible. If that's true, it's interesting in lots of ways. One way it's interesting is if it's true that these same problematics can and often do surface in virtually every so-called area of philosophy, then that itself is a ground for wondering whether philosophy is usefully divided into separate areas of inquiry, as I think nowadays is more and more prone to be the case. At least in America, the tendency is to specialize. What do you do? I do philosophy of mind. What do you do? I do ethics. You read the ethics journals, I read the philosophy of mind journals. We don't need to talk to each other. We have different specialties. We take the model from the scientists. There's physics, there's chemistry, there's biology, then there's biochemistry, then there's the biochemistry of cells, then there's the biochemistry of enzymes. And this is how science grows. This is how science should grow, I think. Part of the progress of science, I think Thomas Kuhn was right about this, can be seen in this evolutionary speciation of the subject. The question is that true of philosophy? The assumption behind the institutionalization of philosophy in America is that philosophy is making progress if it can speciate into specialties. If I'm right about the deep structure of the philosophical problems, I think there's a reason to worry about that. Here's another interesting consequence of my claim, if it's true, that wherever one of these areas of skepticism, one of these varieties of skepticism is possible, the other is possible. If that's true, and you show me an area of philosophy in which, say, people are only worried about Cartesian skepticism, then I have a prediction for you. Kantian skepticism is coming to that area. There's a few areas I think this hasn't quite happened yet, but I think the dialectic will catch up with them in a matter of time. History moves faster and faster. Hegel, I think, was right about this, even if he was slightly wrong about when history ends. And I think it's not long to wait. So, in general, I think philosophy is not a predictive science, but here I actually have a prediction for certain areas of philosophy. But before we test claims like this, I think we need to understand the taxonomy a little better, or we'll have useless discussions about this. So, what I'm going to do next is to try to teach you to understand my taxonomy by first indicating a few of the areas in which these problematics surface. So we can distinguish the deep structure from the clothing of the problem. But I can only do this for a few areas. If I went through each area of philosophy, we'd be here for 10 lectures and we would still be in the introduction. So I'll just give you a few examples quickly. And then the discussion, we can go into the examples in more detail if you like. But before I do that even, I want to go back and just say one thing about one of the many respects in which my labels, Cartesian and Kantian, might seem tendentious as labels for the specific variants of skepticism that I'm going to be calling Cartesian and Kantian, respectively. So let me just say something more about the terminology. If I'm talking about a whole variety, a whole genus of skepticism, then I'll use the word variety. If I'm talking about Cartesian skepticism and philosophy of mind, or some area, then I'll talk about a variant of it, a subspecies of the variety. And a reason my labels might seem strange is because I'm going to be talking about many variants of the skepticism that Descartes and Kant certainly did not talk about. Indeed, I think in the case of Cartesian skepticism, it's arguable, we could discuss this, that Descartes only ever poses one of them clearly, namely skepticism about the external world. He seems to be, well, let's just say that. Whereas I think Kant arguably does explore more variants of what I'm going to call Kantian skepticism, but only more. He's quite oblivious to others. So one case I will discuss, I will call Kantian skepticism and philosophy of language. You will not find this in Kant. But it still counts for me as Kantian skepticism and philosophy of language. So, in claiming that these various variants of each of these problematics, Cartesian and Kantian, occur, I'm not making an historical claim about which problems are or are not present in the writings of Descartes or Kant. That would be a gross misunderstanding. I'm making always a philosophical claim about a congruence, a homology to be found in the shape of the problems themselves, regardless of whose writings they appear in, and regardless of whether the author himself is aware of this homology. Okay, so in the handout, since handouts don't take any time to pass out, I gave you 5 examples of Cartesian skepticism on pages 1 and 2, and then 5 examples of Kantian skepticism on pages 3 and 4. And tonight, perhaps in the bathroom or somewhere, you can look at these in more detail. But but I'm just going to discuss 3 of them quickly now. To go through even 5 of them in detail would take quite long. But I'll just quickly give you 3 cases. And I won't do it in the structure of the handout, which is much more time-consuming. But I'll just give you a quick indication of Cartesian versus Kantian skepticism, first in philosophy of language, then in the case of philosophy of mind, and then the case of philosophy of language. But you have more detail here on the handout and some more sense of how this works for other cases. So in philosophy of perception, before we go into this, here's an interesting thing I don't completely understand, but I will just mention to you, which is for every variety of skepticism, I'm discussing 2 today, Kantian skepticism and Cartesian skepticism, but there are other varieties of skepticism. One that might come up in the discussion that's particularly interesting is Pyrrhonian skepticism, which I think must be distinguished from each of these. But in every variety of skepticism, even if your taxonomy is larger, I think the most classic instance is always from the philosophy of perception. And historically, the first clearly posed instance, I think, is always in the philosophy of perception. And it's an interesting question. Why should that be so? I don't actually have an answer to that question, but I thought I would share it with you because it's something that's occurred to me. I have some speculations, but I don't feel I have a good answer, but I mention it. But it also means, in giving a lecture like this, it's not an accident that I start with philosophy of perception, I think. So, philosophy of perception. In philosophy of perception, the Cartesian skeptic asks, how can I know that things are as my senses present them as being? My senses present my experiences of an external world, but is there really an external world? I'm having an experience of a certain sort, perhaps Descartes, sitting in a dressing gown by the fire. But how can I know that things are as my experience presents them as being? And always, Cartesian skepticism only works, we'll return to this, if the starting example is what I will call a best case of knowledge. I take these words from Stanley Cavell's book, The Claim of Reason. So, if I were to say that I can see a spider over there, 30 feet away, then it's gone. I'm not sure. And you say, do you know it was a spider? I say, yeah, I think it was a spider. And then you say there can be no spiders in the Institute. There's poison spread everywhere. It kills all the spiders. You must be wrong. And then I conclude, okay. Now what's the conclusion here? I think the conclusion is just, I was wrong. I didn't know there was a spider. That's it. The conclusion is just about that claim. I put forward the claim about the spider. You give me a ground for doubt. The ground for doubt is a good doubt. I withdraw my claim. I didn't know there was a spider. I might know many things still. Just when it comes to spiders in the Philosophical Institute in Naples, you have concluded he's not reliable. Maybe about Descartes, he knows something. He doesn't know about spiders. But that's not how Cartesian skepticism works. If I'm worried about whether if I'm lecturing right now, under perfect conditions, and I know what people are, you have to be an expert to recognize a person. It takes a certain kind of expertise to recognize a spider, especially at 30 feet. And if I'm wrong, I put forward this claim. I'm lecturing right now at the Institute, and I'm wrong. And I'm sure to be wrong because of the ground for doubt. And now the ground for doubt has to be a very special kind of ground for doubt. It can't be that you have expert knowledge, I don't, about what kind of poison has been spread in the Institute. The ground for doubt is, but you might be dreaming. How do you know that you're lecturing a student? I say by means of the senses. And the ground for doubt suggests that by means of the senses is not a good way to know. It doesn't give us knowledge. And we conclude, I don't know. Then the conclusion isn't just, I don't know if I'm in the Institute right now. The conclusion is much more extreme. The conclusion generalizes. If I don't know this, then I can't be said to know anything of the respective sort. I can't be said to know anything by means of the skepticisms. That's the form of the Cartesian problematic. So in this particular case, the Cartesian worry then, the form of the Cartesian doubt is going to be, why should I ever trust the testimony of my senses? Should I ever endorse the appearances with which my senses present me? So we get what I will call a Cartesian gap, another feature of Cartesian skepticism we'll talk about. But the structure of the gap here in the philosophy of perception case, notice, is from my mind to the outer world. And the doubt is whether I can really build a secure bridge across this gap, that I'm always stuck on the near side of the gap. That's the form of Cartesian skepticism. What the sides of the gap are can change in the different variants. But the form is, there's a gap, and I'm stuck on the near side. So in the philosophy of perception case, the paradox lies in our apparent inability to answer the question, how can I get to the other side? The way this is put historically is, how can I penetrate the veil of perception? But whether you use a metaphor of a chasm, or a veil, or a screen, it's important to see these metaphors are all metaphors for a problematic that has the same structure. And so there's always a desire to get to another side, and implicitly in Cartesian skepticism usually, there's the imagination of the possibility of a vantage point in which you can occupy both sides. Originally, in Descartes, the famous case of this was God. God's there. He's looking at the situation from, we might say, sideways on. He can see how the world is. He can see inside my mind. He can see if they fit. My vantage point is on the near side of the gap. I can't tell. Well, for Descartes, I can't tell without his help. If I know these are clear and distinct ideas, and I know he's benevolent, I know he won't deceive me, and I know he created me, then I have a way maybe to bootstrap up through his vantage point to a claim about the other side. But without such a vantage, it's hard to see what you could have for knowledge. So Cartesian skepticism, many of the responses have the form of trying to create or somehow bootstrap ourselves to such advantage. The original form of these solutions was theological. The contemporary form of these solutions is scientistic. Science can give us the perspective from which we overcome what is merely parochial in our original representation of how things are from this side. But the form of the problem is the same. The Kantian skeptic about philosophy of perception is preoccupied by a different question. His question is, how can my senses so much as present things as being a certain way? How can my experience so much as intelligibly be of an external world? So the Kantian problematic is focused on the problem of not, should I trust the testimony of my senses, but rather, how can my senses testify? This is a metaphor. The senses testify. People can testify. How do the senses have a voice in which they tell me how things are? Can the metaphor be uncached? What sort of unity must experience possess in order for it to be able to present an appearance about which the Cartesian question could then arise? Should I endorse it? How am I so much as able to enjoy an experience that possesses determinate, world-directed content? How can experience be directed? How can it be determined in such a way that its direction is such that how things are could speak to it? So, given God's help, there would be an answer to the question, yes or no, I am in this situation. So, the Kantian problem here does not focus on a doubt. Is it really the case? The Kantian problem, if it becomes urgent, always has the form of a mystery. And in the philosophy of perception, the Kantian paradox lies in its coming to seem mysterious, that what impinges on my senses could so much as appear to be revelatory of the world. So here too we can speak of a gap, what I will call a Kantian gap. But the Kantian gap always has a different structure, at least on the surface, from the Cartesian gap. In the philosophy of perception case, the gap the Kantian seeks to overcome is from sensory blindness to sensory consciousness, from a form of sensibility upon which things merely causally impinge to one in which things impress themselves as being thus and so. So in Kantian skepticism, we invariably have a story about two different orders. Like in Descartes' case, there might be a problem about mind and world. But the problem is not now, how can mind touch world and cross to the other side? But the problem is, how can something that is built up out of the elements of the one order, the order of the world, so much as have a bearing on the elements on the other side, the elements of the mind? So if the senses are part of my natural constitution, and the senses impinge on me, something hits something in my eye that hits something else. How can this ever add up to something that has a place that could be a ground for knowing something? So it's always a problem about the relationship between logical or conceptual orders of intelligibility, and how they can so much as be related. So that was the philosophy of perception case. Now I'm going to speed up a little bit. Second case on your handout is the problem of other minds. It's a good case to take, I think, as a second case. Some things change, but then some things stay the same. The third case, even more things will change, but some things will stay the same. As we go through the cases, it's what stays the same that gives the structure of my problem. So, in other mind's case, the Cartesian version of the problem goes like this. The person before me, let's say it's Matteo. Matteo is acting for all the world as if he's in pain. He's screaming, he's crying, he's turning red, he's moaning, shaking. But how can I know that he's in pain? So, if I'm a Cartesian, what I want is, remember, a case of indistinguishabilia, a case in which everything could seem just the way it is, but it's not as it seems. So, in the other mind's case, there's many ways to construct such scenarios, both for external world and other minds. But the classic instance in other mind's case is to go, maybe he's pretending. He's a good actor. He wants to deceive. This lecture is so boring. He's falling asleep. He wants to get out of here. How can we arrange this? He pretends to have a medical problem. He starts screaming. He's in pain. Everyone attends to him. He gets him out. The agony of the lecture is over. And again, we can describe the worry that comes. If I ask, how do I know he's not pretending? With the same marks. Is he really in pain? Is he actually in pain? And again, the form of the problem is the same. In a best case of knowledge, where for all the world I can't help but want to rush to his aid. But if I don't know this, I can say, if I don't know this, how can I ever know what someone is feeling? As we might put it in the most metaphorical way. What's going on inside him? How can I know what's inside him? Now the problem is I only see the outside. How do I get to the inside? So the Cartesian problematic here, if you will, is focused on the problem of how to underwrite the testimony of the body. The shaking body, the speaking body, the moaning body, all the stuff that's outside that can hit my senses. The pain itself, that's in there. That can't come into contact with my senses. So again, we have a gap, a Cartesian gap. The gap this time that we want to bridge is from the other's outer bodily movements to his inner states. So in one way, it's backwards from our first problematic. First problematic, we were in the inside. And the question was, how can we know what's going on the outside? Now we're on the outside of Matteo. We want to know, how can we know what's going on the inside? This direction makes no difference to its counting as a Cartesian problematic. What matters, again, I say, is the homology of structure. So this version of the Cartesian skeptic will ask a question like this to try to bring out the similarity. How can I penetrate the screen of the other's body and obtain a view of what's really happening on the inside? I need some way of comparing the outside and the inside. Matteo doesn't quite have that. I don't have that. Again, we need some other vantage point from which both these things can be seen. The Kantian skeptic in this area of philosophy, again, preoccupied by a different question. How can the human body so much as seem to express the human state? It's just physical stuff. It's just fleshy matter. It's in one configuration or it's another configuration. How can it be expressive of anything more than physical values? It's biomatter. How can this biomatter have the content pain, anger, joy, happiness, hesitation? What about it can have such a reference, content, or meaning, or intention? So the paradox here, again, will lie in things coming to seem a mystery, as I put it before. Here the mystery is how an expanse of fleshy matter can be immediately revelatory of inner life. It can be an appearance of pain, for example. So the Kantian problematic is focused on the question, to borrow some words from a great philosopher, how does the human body so much as furnish a picture of the human soul? How can there be such a relation between picture and picture, even in the case of pretending? So the gap the Kantian seeks to overcome is again like the other Kantian gap. Different structure. This time we can put the gap this way. It's from an inexpressive physical or biological entity to an animated field of human expression. From a psychologically neutral locus of bodily movements and sounds to the communicative body of a palpably suffering, desiring, pondering human being. I don't say Kant raised that question. I say that question has the same structure as the one he raised. That too is a Kantian problematic. Third example. I take it from the philosophy of language. This is the one, we now get to things that are much more fashionable in philosophy. One of the things I hope the lectures as a whole will bring out is how fashion can be misleading. Things that seem really new can just be because we've changed the form of, we've changed the matter of the problem without changing the form. We're actually not making any progress. So we get to some fashionable things, but part of what I'm interested in is how we still have very much the same problems. In philosophy of language, the problem used to be a Cartesian problem. It used to go like this. How can I know that my interpretation of something, a text, an utterance, a signpost, is correct? How can I be sure that this is what is really meant? So maybe we have a sign here with an arrow that says Napoli. And I'm driving, trying to come back from Pompeii, tired. Come to the sign, arrow, go that way. I know how this sort of signpost, in the shape of a pointing arrow, is usually to be interpreted. But how do I know in this case that my interpretation is the right interpretation? I've noticed that some things are quite different in people's. There's various gestures, for instance, I've noticed that not only don't we have them in Chicago, but insofar as I understand them, I have the wrong interpretation. I think they're telling me to come, and they're telling me something much worse than just to go. So the arrow, how do I know how they use the arrow in Naples? Maybe actually, but if I don't know this, if, as Derrida says, interpretation always presupposes the possibility of misinterpretation. If that were true, Derrida were right about that. Derrida, I think, is very much in the Cartesian problematic in this respect. Then how can I ever be said to know what something means? The infinite deferral of the signifier is fancy language for something that to Descartes would look like something that undercuts my entitlement to knowledge. So here the gap the Cartesian seeks to bridge is between his understanding of the meaning of the sign, his default interpretation of the meaning of the sign, and what the sign actually means. The inside now is my interpretation, it's my understanding. The outside is the sign itself. It's its meaning, not my construal of its meaning. How can I penetrate now the penumbra of interpretation and obtain a view of the meaning itself? This problem is no longer popular as a problem in the philosophy of language. Now in philosophy, it's still very popular in my country in English departments. People who work on Shakespeare go, how do we know this is the right interpretation of Othello? And pretty soon it turns out everybody has their own interpretation of Othello. And there's no such thing as the right interpretation. They don't necessarily draw the Cartesian conclusion, but I don't know why they don't draw the Cartesian conclusion, because they are stuck in the Cartesian problematic. If everything is merely an interpretation of the sign, then we have exactly the problem of Descartes' streaming argument, but with a different inside and a different outside. What's popular in analytic philosophy instead, in philosophy of language right now, is very much a version of the Kantian problematic. The Kantian skeptic in this area, in philosophy of language, worries about this question: how can a sequence of mere marks or noises so much as appear to mean something? So the Kantian paradox Why isn't it, again, coming to seem a mystery now, how a mere sequence of dead signs could so much as appear to be a lie with significance? As Wittgenstein says, the sign itself is dead. And then it looks like we must say, what breathes life into the sign? And that looks like it must be something that is added to the sign. And whatever is added to the sign, how can it have that power? So the Kantian problematic is here, focused on the question, how does a linguistic performance acquire, if you will, the physiognomy of meaning? What sort of unity must it possess in order to appear to be the sort of thing about which the question can aptly arise? What does it mean? Is this what it means? So the gap the Kantian seeks to overcome, and now we have a third example of what I call the Kantian gap. In this case, in philosophy of language, is from a meaningless sequence of marks or noises to determinate expressions of linguistic thought, from a semantically neutral concatenation of scratches, sounds, to a legible field, perhaps misinterpreted, but interpretable fields of intelligible meanings. So that was quickly 3 areas of philosophy in which I gave you 3 variants of Cartesian skepticism and then Kantian skepticism. I said in your handout I gave you 5. In a few minutes in discussion, if you want more, they're free. I can give you more. And but my claim is that I could go on and multiply such pairs of examples of each of these varieties of skepticism from other areas of philosophy. I take it that variants of each arise in philosophy of law, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, and so on. But I hope that these foregoing 3 pairs of examples suffice for giving you what I want to give you today, which is, I put it as a preliminary overview of the twin problematics I seek to isolate. And now, just so you're not left without any conclusion at all, I thought I would just say a couple of remarks, and then I'll conclude and we can continue tomorrow. The first thing I want to show you is already, even at this very early stage in our inquiry, I think we can see a first form of benefit, a first form of philosophical insight that can come if we really have a good taxonomy of varieties of skepticism. If you had such a taxonomy, I don't pretend that I've really given you such a perspicuous overview, but I'm saying if we really had a good one and we have the beginnings of one now, then I think it would allow you to command a much clearer overview of the relations of symmetry and asymmetry that obtain among variants within a single variety of skepticism, within the Cartesian variants, or within the Kantian variants. So if you command, for instance, a clear view of the homology of structure exhibited across a couple of these variants, then it puts you in a position to bring resources derived in the consideration of one of these variants to the other. So say you conclude that a problem of, say, the Cartesian form, if it remains in the Cartesian form, is insoluble. You reflect for much time on Cartesian philosophy of perception, you think, we got to do something. Can't solve this problem like this. Then you will save a lot of time. If you realize you have another problem that's exactly the same shape, you can save yourself a few years arriving at the same conclusion. Or say you think, I have a solution to Cartesian skepticism. So this isn't, the point I'm making is sort of neutral with respect to your philosophical commitments. If I'm right about the homology of structure, but we really have the same problem, merely its clothing is changing, then at least whatever you achieve in working on the problem, it allows you to recognize it again and realize that what you concluded or achieved should be concludable or achievable again. And I say this because it's quite remarkable, I think, how many people don't realize this. That is, for instance, I noticed on the continent, Germany and France, there are many philosophers today that are clear that whatever else they want to do, they want to find a way to resist the Cartesian assumption in the philosophy of perception. They think that, say, Heidegger has shown us that if we think that all perception of external objects requires an inference from how things seem to how things are, then we're screwed. We must not think of perception that way. We must think of perception as something that makes us open to the world. Some wonderful phrase like that. And so, such a continental philosopher, in my experience, often wants to avoid that assumption because she realizes if she makes such an assumption in philosophy of perception, she will be saddled with a Cartesian gap, leaving her sealed inside her own mind, unable to claw her way back out to an unobstructed glimpse of the external world. And yet, that same philosopher, when she turns, say, to the philosophy of language, yields to the corresponding Cartesian assumption without a pang, finding utterly innocent the assumption, all understanding presupposes interpretation, and saddling herself with a gap of a congruent sort, leaving herself sealed now within her horizon of interpretations, unable to claw her way back to an unobstructed view of the meaning of a sign. Last comment, just to anticipate something I know will come up in the discussion if I don't say it. So I'll just preempt this one question, if you'll forgive me. I purported at the beginning of today to be furnishing ways you might unpack the difference between Cartesian and Kantian skepticism by offering you various ways of unpacking the contrast between a problematic centered on knowledge and one centered on the conditions of knowledge, or the possibility of knowledge. And I started that way because that's what people usually say. So I wanted to start in some place that sounded familiar. But that way of putting the contrast makes it seem like my distinction between Cartesian and Kantian skepticism, it is a distinction between two forms of epistemological worry, a worry about knowledge. One is, do we have it? The other is how it's possible. But if you've been paying careful attention, you should already realize there's something wrong with that. That way of putting things is at best misleading. What's right is that it is indeed constitutive of the Cartesian problematic that it be clothed in epistemological form. Cartesian skepticism and philosophy of perception is how can we have perceptual knowledge. Cartesian skepticism and philosophy of mathematics is about how can we have mathematical knowledge. Cartesian skepticism is always an epistemological problem. The focus in the Cartesian problematic is always on knowledge claims. And the problematic brings the relationship between our knowledge claims and some aspect of reality into question. What makes someone such and such a sort of Cartesian skeptic, a Cartesian skeptic about perception, say, is that he's exercised by a doubt regarding whether we can have knowledge of such and such a sort. And given the conceptual relationship between the concepts of knowledge and the concepts of doubt, therefore, the Cartesian skeptic, in his worry about whether we have this form of knowledge, is aptly characterized, correctly characterized always, as somebody who doubts. The first step in Cartesian skepticism is always to take a best case. The second step is to doubt something. It has the form of a doubt. What figures in the Cartesian problematic as a doubt, as a worry about the relation between knowledge claims and some aspect of reality, comes to look from the vantage of the Kantian problematic like only a very local instance of a much more general kind of concern. A worry about the relation between any claim, any representation with content, true, false, or fantastic, and reality. In making, say, a claim, whether or not one takes oneself to be knowledgeable, you make yourself answerable to how things are. You make yourself, as I put it before, vulnerable. Even if you'll never know the answer, even if you can't know the answer. And so the Kantian asks, how are you able to accomplish that feat? How are you able to achieve such answerability or vulnerability in your thought? in your experience. So the Kantian problematic, if we're clear about it, we see is only optionally clothed in epistemological form. It's at its root a much more fundamental nature. The worry that exercises a Kantian skeptic, what I'm calling a Kantian skeptic, is misunderstood if it's taken to turn exclusively on matters that have to do with knowledge. What comes into view, even in Kant himself, in Kant's own text, the Critique of Pure Reason, initially, under the heading of the conditions of the possibility of knowledge, if you read Kant clearly, you will see, I think, are also conditions of the possibility of mindedness as such. If you don't meet these conditions, it's not just that you don't know, but otherwise you can think, dream, experience. And in Kant himself, he alternates with considerable frequency between very different ways of characterizing the conditions at question. For instance, speaking of them as first the conditions of the possibility of knowledge, and then conditions of the possibility of experience, and applying that they might equally aptly be characterized as things like the conditions of the possibility of, as I put it before, objectively valid judgment. Or I think, to take another case we had, the conditions of the possibility of the sensory consciousness of an object. So the Kantian skeptic is only inaptly characterized as someone who suffers from a doubt. Kantian skepticism is directed at the possibility of our exercising our cognitive faculties generally, with respect to some area of philosophy. Kantian skeptics about mathematics is someone who's concerned that mathematical thinking cannot have the integrity to even so much as be about what it wants to be about, and so on. So, if that's right, then doubting is just as much one of these capacities that is in question. Where Descartes takes his capacity to dream and doubt for granted, those capacities themselves are problematized in the Kantian movement. But then someone might think, and let's just make this clear, if that's right, then if a Kantian skeptic isn't someone who suffers from a doubt, if he gives us a problem where doubt itself and its possibility are questioned, then doesn't that constitute a sufficient ground for insisting that what you, Professor Conant, are calling a Kantian skeptic is not a kind of skeptic at all? Isn't a skeptic someone who has a doubt? Don't I at least learn that much correctly in my introductory philosophy class? So let me be clear on the following point. We'll say much more about this tomorrow. I just want to be clear on the following point. My aim is not to legislate how the word skeptic should be used. At this point, I am showing you differences. You can choose your terminology. My aim is to illuminate some of the diverse ways in which philosophers, in fact, often use the word. The problematic I talked about in philosophy of language is called meaning skepticism. The second one, the Kantian one. That's the name for it. The word skepticism is used in this context. Kant himself, when he's talking about skepticism, I think primarily has in mind what I'm calling Kantian skepticism. I think Wittgenstein, when he talks about skepticism, is often worried about something that has this form, for instance, in the rule following, problematic. But that's a fact about how philosophers use the word. Often they also want it to mean something like Cartesian skepticism. Sometimes they get very confused about what they mean because they're talking about it all at once. I'm not legislating how you should use it. This goes back to the question we began with. Is this merely a nominal unity or not? Something we will discuss on Wednesday. But my aim right now is just to give you an overview of some of the ways it's used. We can mark the differences. We, for the moment, can let it be a question how we should talk. And my eventual aim, starting tomorrow, is to then allow us to ask and explore the following question. How are these various problematics, the Cartesian one and the Kantian one, related? That will be tomorrow's task. Thank you. So I'm hoping there will be discussion. I know that I have a tremendous advantage, which is that you have to ask your questions in English if I'm to understand them. English is my native language and not yours, but I hope you're not worried about that. I'm a teacher. I don't mind if it takes more than one try to ask your question. We also have several people here who speak English well, so we can, if necessary, you can ask your question in Italian if I can't understand it, and you can collectively translate it for me. So I hope you won't let this stop you. Yes, thank you. The first question is always the most difficult.
I'd like to go back to the problem
Yes.
of other minds.
Uh-huh.
Which problem?
Other minds. I was thinking about a case
Yes.
which was discussed by Stanislav
Yes.
in the Prima,
Yes.
which is important for Wittgenstein
Yes.
as well. And I was wondering whether this case should be seen as, if you can frame it into the Cartesian skepticism or Kantian skepticism, or maybe we need another variety for
Yes.
it. The case is that of the stranger.
Yes.
Stranger. I mean by that the case of one person who just reacts in a strange way.
Yes.
It's just like, I don't know, when you comfort him, he will shout.
Yes.
If you beat him, he will laugh.
Yes.
This kind of thing.
Yes.
Because it seems to me that in this case the problem is not about something like pretending against really being a thing.
Yes.
Nor the case is one of like that his behavior is not expressive, so we don't have a problem about meaningfulness. And it seems like more a problem about forms of life and
Yes.
difference of form of life. How can I tell
Yes.
that we have the same form of life? So what
Yes.
do you think about this case?
Yes. It's hard for me to tell you what I really think about that without anticipating my next lectures, but that's okay. So I think I will just give away some suspense and anticipate some things I was going to say tomorrow and the next day, because I haven't said enough to answer this without going to the more material. But before I do, I might just give you some background. One way I got into thinking about these issues is because I became very confused, I think, by questions not unlike the question you're asking. And more generally, leaving even that question aside for a moment, noticing that different philosophers who I admired, Hilary Putnam, John McDowell, Cora Diamond, Stanley Cavell, other philosophers who I didn't admire quite as much, who I thought were very interesting, Bernard Williams, Saul Kripke, and so forth, they'd all be discussing something called skepticism. And it was very hard to, I'd read some of McDowell's saying, I think this is very interesting, there's something right about it. And I'd read something by Cavell, and I think this is very right, there's something right. But then I couldn't see how to put them together. I'd just be completely confused by whether they were discussing the same problem, whether they were disagreeing. If they were disagreeing, what were they disagreeing about exactly? And it was trying to think about that led me to want to step back and get clear about what do people mean by skepticism? What are the different shapes of the problem? How are these shapes related to each other? So I could then have enough overview of the landscape to say, these people are talking about the same thing, these things people are talking about apparently different things. How are they related? Is there a disagreement? We'll talk more about this on Wednesday. And one moment in this was something Cavell really insists upon in the second half of the Claim of Reason. And his discussion of the stranger is actually on the way to making this point in Part 4 of the Claim of Reason, which is what he calls the asymmetry between other mind skepticism and external world skepticism. Now, his discussion of that asymmetry is quite complicated. And it folds a number of different things together in the asymmetry. And my own view in a sense, the view I want to be able to entitle you to by the end of the third lecture would be one in which what I conclude about Cavell is that there are some things that are genuine asymmetries, but they don't go as deep as he thinks they do. And the reason he thinks the asymmetry goes deep is because he's missing the fact that where one of these varieties of skepticism is possible, the other is possible. And so, in the case of other mind skepticism, he starts with the Cartesian problem, but then he realizes there's another problem, which no longer has the Cartesian shape. And then he wants to say, that makes it different than the philosophy of perception case. I think it doesn't make a difference. It means he only noticed that something else is happening here that can also happen there. If we have time, I was thinking of talking about this on Wednesday, but I'll just point it out to you. If you look at quotation 11, it's actually the last quotation in your handout. I didn't even know if we'd have time to get to it on Wednesday, but we can at least mention it today. This is a passage from Cavell. And what's happening in this passage is that he's thinking about the other minds case in such a way that it's turning into a Kantian problem. At the end of that passage, he even is paraphrasing the passage from Wittgenstein I used to explain Kantian problem in philosophy of language, namely, the signs are dead. I can't breathe life into them. So the worry is that a worry about how the human body can be more, as it comes out in this passage, than a stone. Or maybe it's not this passage, but it's a passage right next to this passage in the book. I can't remember the quote. So that's where Cavell is going here. And the thing that I'm anticipating here from my future lectures, but I'll just say, because I can't answer the question without saying it, is that my view, but this is my view, it's not obviously right, is that there is an internal connection between various varieties of skepticism. It's not a merely nominal unity. And for the two varieties I discussed today, Cartesian and Kantian skepticism, there is a connection between them. It's very important to me that the apparatus I'm introducing today, in the first part of tomorrow, does not presuppose my view. I want my apparatus to be philosophically neutral. So it doesn't have any, you don't need any collateral commitments to go and identify and say, this is Cartesian, this is Kantian. I can teach you to do that without agreeing with me about anything in philosophy. All we have to do is describe things clearly. We'll talk some more next time about the details of the description. But then, once we have the apparatus and we can describe things clearly and we can ask a clear question, what's the relationship between this variant of Cartesian skepticism and this variant of Kantian skepticism, say in other minds? Then we can ask the question, what is their connection? And about that, I have a view. It's a contentious view. It's a philosophical view. I don't pretend the conclusion, my answer to that question is mere description in the way the use of my apparatus is. But I hope I can make it convincing. And the view is, I think, a view that Kant already had, and that Wittgenstein agrees with Kant about. And this is, I think, a deep agreement between Wittgenstein and Kant. Namely that they form different stages on a dialectic. And more generally, my view about the various varieties of skepticism, even if we have more, is that the way they're related is, as Hegel would have said, dialectical. That is, you take a philosophical problem, it starts by having a certain shape. And if you continue to think through the problem, one feature of the problem is that as it becomes radicalized, the shape of the problem itself changes. And that this is something that happens over time. I think Hegel is the first person to really appreciate this deeply. And that even if we give you more than two varieties of skepticism, I think we will be able to arrange them all along a dialectical trajectory. And so specifically then, now I can say to you, with respect to skepticism about other minds, I think Cartesian skepticism about other minds, if one starts to think it through to a certain point, turns into Kantian skepticism in other minds. And I think, although he would not use this vocabulary for putting the point, this is something that Cavell sees, and it's happening in part 4 of the Claim of Reason. And his discussion of the stranger, he sees this only about the problem of other minds, however. The stranger is the beginning of this transition. And indeed, dialectically, for each of these skepticisms, there needs to be such a transition. And wherever you find someone discussing a problem that is at this transitional point, if you ask, is this Cartesian skepticism or Kantian skepticism, you will be confused. It will not fit either clearly. But I think there are ways to see that it's actually a transitional stage. I think Hume himself is a very interesting figure in this story. Hume is somebody who's first starting to see the possibility of a Kantian problematic, but more clearly about some questions than others. Most clearly about the problem of causation. But in other questions, for instance, about body, Hume's external body, Hume's initial formulation of the problem is much more Cartesian. Though there are certain moments late in Hume's writing where he starts to see the problem in slightly more Kantian terms. But if you look at Hume's text and you look at some of his discussions and you say, which is this? It will seem to be a hybrid. And that kind of hybrid, I think, is very interesting. So one of the things I'll do next time is to give us a better way to discuss these two varieties of skepticism, is I will define them in terms of features. Very much the way in which, if you want to define an aesthetic genre, like, say, the Western, what makes something a Western? Well, I could give you a bunch of features. It takes place in the West, there are cowboys, there are guns, there's a saloon, there's good and evil, there's the beginning of civilization. These are quite a variety of features, It's the beginning of civilization and we need to set up laws. That's quite abstract. There are guns and horses and saloons, those are very concrete. They're going to a whole set of features. But many Westerns, if you look at a Western, you'll have some of these features and you won't have others. And you can find lots of movies that have these features, but they're not Westerns. So what makes something a Western is the way the features are connected, the way if they're fundamental features, if you want to change one of them, you have to do it in a systematic way. It doesn't have to be in the West. It can be set on another planet, it can be set in Australia, but it has to have the features that the West has. It makes it the West. I will define these genres, and then what we'll see is what it is for something to belong to one of these, then I will then say genres of skepticism, is a matter of degree. And what we have in the transitional cases is something where the Cartesian features are starting to turn into Kantian features, and so we don't clearly have something that fits either one. And there's much to say about this. So what's happening in The Stranger is we don't yet have something that has the form of Kantian skepticism. You're absolutely right. We haven't arrived at a Kantian paradox about expressing this. But on the other hand, we've taken a step away from the Cartesian problem in our minds. We're not just worried about, it's absolutely clear what he's expressing in my example with Matteo. What Matteo is expressing in my example is pain. That was absolutely clear. And the question is, how can I know he's really in pain? Well, it's clear what he's expressing. The problem with the problem of stranger is turning to a problem of interpretation. We're still assuming he's a being who can express. But now, what I was calling the determinacy of the content is becoming a problem. Not just the being of the thing that is determinately being expressed. Is he expressing pain or happiness? Is he speaking or groaning? Or is this just how he calls his cats, and he's not speaking to me at all? What kind of content does it have as any? So we're still at the edge of allowing that he's expressing in some way or other. But there's a problem now about how it is that my relation to others in general isn't of the form of my relation to a stranger. What is it allows me to overcome strangeness, alienness of this sort to other people? But if that problem, if just pressed a little bit more, then becomes the problem. But if I can't see what it is to overcome strangeness, that actually undercuts my entitlement to see him as expressing anything. I can only see him as expressing something. If some expressions have a determinate content, I can understand. So you're right, we don't yet have a Kantian problem when we put it as the issue of the stranger. But if you just turn the page in Cavell, that's the problem he's moving towards. And this is part of how how he moves in that case from the Cartesian problem to having the bottom follow the Cartesian problem. And it turns into the Kantian problem. But it's in the context of a discussion in which he's trying to bring out that there's something special and unique about skepticism of other minds that makes it different from other skepticisms, because this can happen. And I think he's wrong about that. Also, because Cavell thinks, we'll talk about this on Wednesday, because Cavell thinks, the objection I made to myself at the end, I think, is somewhat in the spirit of something Cavell might want to say. I think because Cavell thinks of skepticism as, above all, an issue in which there's a certain kind of doubt that generalizes and so forth. The problem we have when the problem of the stranger is radicalized, so it becomes the problem at the end of this quotation 11, he wouldn't call that skepticism. He thinks, this is, he'll talk about things like the problem of soul blindness and things like that, and what it would be not to be soul blind. But he doesn't use the word skepticism anymore, because he thinks of skepticism, using my language now, as having a generically Cartesian structure. And then there's something extraordinary about skepticism on other minds, which is it can be radicalized in this way. But then what happens to it, he doesn't any longer think of as skepticism. But what you brought out about the problem of the stranger, and you're both sensing it's related to both of these things, but that it doesn't fit either, is extremely, makes me very happy as a question, because I think this is connected to its being in between. And I think there are many such in-between cases, if one knows how to look for them. So if you, for instance, compare Kripke's original article about rule following to the book about rule following, you will see something like this. His original article is much more in between and confused about what the issue is. And then when he writes the book, I think he becomes much clearer that he has what I'm calling a problem of a Kantian form. And he comments on this explicitly. So in the preface of the book, he then says, I originally presented the problem as if it were an epistemological problem. But actually the epistemological form of the problem is a ladder we must climb up and throw away. So it looks like initially the problem, do you all know Kripke's book on skepticism and other minds? Do you know this book? So there's a problem about, what is it, 57 and, I'm trying to add two numbers, 67, 58. Trying to add 67 and 58. When I get it, I get 125, but I meet this character, and he says 57 and 68 is 5. When we've added any other numbers, he and I agree. When we come to this sum, he says 5. And it looks like the original problem is when somebody else is agreeing with me in the ordinary cases, 2 plus 3 equals 5. How do I know what his understanding of plus is mine, adding, or it's this other guy's, which Kripke calls quadding, which in this sequence agrees with me, but when we come to this sum, actually has a different value. So the function that I call plus is a different function than the one he does. Notice how it has now a Cartesian form. There's this entire space over which his performance is indistinguishable from mine. The Cartesian form now is about the present and the future. What was inside and outside now, accessible to me and not accessible, now is given a temporal form, but still a Cartesian problematic. There's the things that are immediately available to me, his performances that I have seen. And there's something he will go on and do, which is a future performance I haven't seen. But how do I know that the answer to how to go on the same way for him will be the same in the future as the present? The present and the past is indistinguishable. The future I cannot see. It's inaccessible, but it might be different. Only if I could see it do I know he's adding and not cladding. But I can't get there. And so it looks like the problem in Kripke is, how can I tell whether he's adding or cladding? That's a Cartesian problem. It's a problem about knowing what he's really doing here. So it looks like I want to see his mind and see something I can't see. But Kripke's real problem, when he starts to see better what Wittgenstein's actually doing, the rule-following problem, when Wittgenstein says, but if every interpretation can be made to accord with the rule, then nothing accords with the rule, and we cannot speak of accord. That's what Wittgenstein says. Kripke sees the real problem is, as he later puts it, not that I cannot tell whether he's adding or cladding, but there's no fact of the matter about whether he's adding or cladding. Even if God could see into his mind, he wouldn't know what he was looking for to tell. So the vantage point of the privileged person who can see both sides, to bridge the Cartesian gap, that vantage point helps no longer if you have a Cartesian problem. Problem is one of content. No matter how good your epistemic access is, it's not clear how you can have such content. But if you look at Kripke's early formulation, you have this stuff where he's worried about, something like the problem of the stranger. He's doing these things, and I know he's doing something, but I don't know whether he's adding. And so that's moving from I can't tell whether he's adding or cladding to I can't tell really what he's doing at all. But then the real problem is there's no fact of the matter about his meaning this or that. And that problem is much more radical. That problem means that when you started reading Kripke's example, you assumed you understood what he was saying. But now, the sentence, there's no fact of the matter about whether he's adding or cladding, is itself a sentence about which there's no fact of the matter about what it means. Now we can't doubt anymore. When you say, I cannot tell whether he's adding or cladding, I understand what it is I cannot tell. I have a doubt. I can exercise my capacity to doubt. I want to know whether it's adding or cladding. I understand both options. But epistemically, I don't know. If we have the Kantian problem, then we have a problem that it's not clear how it is that my words can so much as mean something. And that means the sentence in which I say, it's no longer clear how my words can so much as mean something, is a sentence about which it's no longer clear what it means. Which means now, the very possibility of thinking about the subject I want to think about, the very possibility of having a doubt about meaning, is itself a possibility that's undercut. But so the Kantian problem is such a radical problem that it's very hard to get into focus. And so in any area of philosophy in which I think this has happened, it's happened very gradually. Kant, I think, was the first one, especially in philosophy of perception, to see that there's this radicalized problem. And I think actually most of the early reception of Kant is people misunderstanding Kant and giving Cartesian readings of Kant. And then I think, in other minds, with Cavell, with meaning, with Kripke, the initial formulation always involves these sort of transitional cases. Cavell's very unusual because he goes all the way to the extreme problem. He didn't have to first write an article about the problem of the stranger and then something else. Kripke is a more typical case. And even he is impressive because he both wrote the transitional piece and he radicalized it in the book. But usually it takes several stages. It's more like the transition from Hume to Kant. But so I think this is itself a representative instance you've given, these features of the problem of the stranger. But they have to be discussed afterwards. First you see the Cartesian case, then you see the Kantian case, and then you also see there are these cases where the genre is changing. It's going from, one kind of movie to another kind of movie. And in the middle, it's hard to say what kind of movie it is. It's a bit of a mess. Yes?
Usually the second question is always the worst one, so I apologize myself.
Okay. Thank you for the warning.
I have a couple of questions, but I think I will just pose one. In the list of features
Yes.
you giving us.
Yes. So this is
No, the features that came after. When you were talking about, you are presenting us Cartesian and Kantian skepticism. You told in presenting the three fields in
Yes.
which they apply.
Yes.
You presented many features
Yes, I
that
mentioned.
characterize
Yeah.
such skepticism.
Yeah.
And one of them is the gap between something external and something internal.
Well, that's
Or-
not,
yeah.
that's not, let's be careful here. And one difficulty here is to, not to mistake features of the variant for features of the variety.
No,
Features
of the
was-
varieties. I was
yeah.
talking about the varieties.
Right, but so internal and external is not a feature of Cartesian skepticism. That's always a
That's what-
species of the genus. So it is true, and this is perhaps confusing, that the first two cases I discussed, philosophy of perception and other minds, were both about the internal destiny. The first case was, I'm on the inside, I can't get to the outside, the fireplace, of the classroom. The second case was, I'm on the outside, I can't get to the inside of my tail. But the third case, philosophy of language, it's a little harder to say already. That's about the inside and the outside. I have interpretation, and then I want the meaning. Is that inside or outside? Well, there's different ways to put the philosophy of language case. It could be, you think the interpretation is in my head. You think that, then it's inside, outside.
Yeah.
But you might think, this is a more common version of the problem, it's in the community. You know, community has an interpretation. But then, what is it for the community as a whole to be wrong? And if you think, well, the community as a whole can't be wrong, then it looks like there's a problem about objectivity. Is that inside and outside? Well, it's not geometrically inside. It's no longer clear where to point. You can't point between what meters. But you might think, well, the community is something you can draw a circle around. And so you can be inside the community or outside the community. But then take the case we just had in the discussion about rule following, encrypting and plus and plus. The Cartesian problem there was the performances so far, and what will happen in the future. Is that inside and outside?
Yes, my worry was
Yes.
precisely
Yes,
this one,
yes.
and my question was about this, that there are examples for, and the one I was thinking of was that one of self-knowledge.
Yes. Yes.
When there, from one perspective, it doesn't seem that there is one inside and one outside. But from another perspective,
Yes.
and this connects with my second question, the question about if the skeptic question is as you was telling us, a mere epistemological question.
Yes, yes.
I was thinking about self-knowledge and the discussion made by Bill Gramy, for example,
Yes.
when he, in one of the last book,
Yes.
he talked about self-knowledge as a problem of internal and external.
Yes, yes.
My question is, how can we face how can we interpret the problems, for example, that of self-knowledge,
Yes.
when there isn't seems to be one clear internal
Yes.
separated from
Yes.
separate from the
Yes.
external one.
Right. But I don't want, it's not a problem for me, because I don't want the characterization of either skepticism to turn on the metaphor of internal and external. So it's not part of my account of Cartesian skepticism that the gap, you British, is from something inside to outside or vice versa. That was just true of my first two cases. But those are, as it were, merely differentia of those cases, that it is inside and outside. What matters is that you have something that has, well, I will give you more precise features tomorrow, but they're on the handout already. So if you look at Roman 4 on page 4, I give you 9 Cartesian features. And If something has all 9 of these features, I think it's very clearly a Cartesian problem. But there's nothing about inside and outside there. It's not part of the formulation of Cartesian skepticism. And it does have to start with the best case. There does have to be a doubt. I think this doubt will turn on there being indistinguishability. In the Kripke case, all the performances so far are the same. But how can I know what will come next will be the same? But I don't think there's a good way to put that as inside and outside. But it's still a Cartesian problem for me, because it has all these features. So that the self-knowledge problem can fully have a Cartesian form and can fully have a Kantian form, though it does not have an internal or external form, is fine with me. I think if you think this Cartesian skepticism depends upon the internal-external structure, then you will not see the generality of what I want to call Cartesian skepticism. That would be precisely to mistake the clothing for the real problem for me. So that's exactly the kind of inessential difference that I want people to overcome. It's very much a picture that makes it seem internal and external. So some people think the solution to Cartesian skepticism is to realize that meanings aren't in the head. You know? And part of what I want to bring out is that this move can involve very superficial therapy, philosophically. That you can keep a problem that has exactly the same shape while going from something inside to something public. In the rule following, people think, wonderful discovery to realize that meanings aren't located here, they're located in the community. And then the community theory of language again has exactly the same problems. It's just the solipsism of the we instead of the solipsism of the I. But the problem hasn't changed its structure at all. And so what matters is the structural solipsism of not being able to bridge the Cartesian gap. It's not the inessential, as it were, furniture of the gap, whether we think it's, features of a race cogitans, or features of a community, or features of present uses of media versus future, and so forth. So your question, from my point of view, is very friendly and helpful, because I would say, exactly, if you think what I'm calling a Cartesian gap depends upon the metaphor of internal and external, then you will not be able to extend this to self-knowledge. But it doesn't depend on that. Look at my 9 features. If it has these features, then it will be a Cartesian problem of self-knowledge. And if it has the next 9 features on page 5, then it will be a Kantian problem of self-knowledge. And there are both out there in the literature. And the word skepticism is used about both, which is confusing. I was going to say one more thing, but I forgot what it is. Sorry. Sorry, I forgot. I had one more thought, but I lost it. So I think you're completely right about that. I just agree. I simply welcome the truth of what you say. It's not a problem for me. But my exposition might have been confusing because.
No, my question was.
Yes. Yes.
Since you only gave us 3 examples,
yes.
I was wondering about one example. It was clear that the problem was not external and internal.
Right, and I think that's true of the Kripke case. If you look at number 5 on my handout, which is about philosophy of art, that's clearly not an internal and external one either, I think. So I agree. And once we go on and multiply our examples, I think this will become very clear. The internal and external is really just a picture that people use to make certain versions of the problem more vivid. And then what happens is they fall in love with this feature of the picture and it misleads them. It's not really of the essence of the problem at all. Even where they're using the internal and external language.
I have a question that's not so clear in my mind, so I'm trying to explain it.
That's the best kind.
It's a question about Wittgenstein.
Yes.
I can see quite clearly that Wittgenstein is involved in both the problematics, Kantian one and Cartesian one.
That's exactly right.
And the question is Wittgenstein a response to the Kantian problematics that involves also a response to the Cartesian one, or is there any kind of responses between the two problematics? Because
I can also quite clearly see the Kantian response,
Yes.
the response to the Kantian problematic, but not so clearly the response to the Cartesian one. So it's in Wittgenstein.
Again, that's a great question. I thought it was very clearly asked. And it's really the question. It's really one of the questions I want to be answering in my third lecture. So in a way, you've completely anticipated my third lecture. But in order not to be too elusive, I will start to tell you some of what I will say in the third lecture, and then we'll talk. I'll say this in detail in the third lecture. But so we have the question: how is the Cartesian and the Kantian skeptics related? One answer, which I think some people more or less implicitly and explicitly make, even if they don't have my terminology, but where they discover it, is they say, I think we can see Cavell making this assertion when he looks at Kripke and philosophy of mind, saying they're not connected. We shouldn't call this weird thing Kripke is talking about skepticism. But even if you did call it skepticism, it would just be a unity of meaning. There's no connection. Those are different problems. I think there's many people who want to compare Kant and Wittgenstein. There's a whole industry. There must be 50 articles and 30 books written called Kant and Wittgenstein. And the title is that. And there's a reason that people are drawn to them together. And there's also profound differences. And I think most of what's written about is not very good. But I think this question, what is the relation between Cartesian and Kantian skepticism, is actually a really good question for seeing some of the deep affinity between Kant and Wittgenstein, and also locating some of the differences within the deep affinity. The way I would put the deep affinity between Kant and Wittgenstein is like this: they both are in a position to ask this question. That's already, I think, enormous achievement. And I wouldn't have been able to write these things if they hadn't written their things. So this is a question that's asked in their work and answered in their work. It's a useful thing to see about each of them. And up to a point, they give the same answer. What the generality of the question is much greater than Wittgenstein, because he's seen there's many more variants. But with respect to some the things that Kant can identify as variants of Cartesian skepticism, Kantian skepticism, he gives up to a point the same answer. And what they both think, I think, is that they are connected. They are dialectically connected. Cartesian skepticism is the initial version of a problem, which, if thought through, turns into a Kantian skeptical problem. And Kant, well, specifically thought this was Hume's merit, was to have seen this for some areas of philosophy. And that what Kant did was he wanted to generalize Hume's problem. For Kant, generalizing means seeing that applies to all 12 of the categories, not just a couple, cause and maybe body. So that's an important connection. But then this question about treatment. How do you treat skepticism once you see that skepticism names this large, complicated dialectic? And for Kant, the way you treat Kantian skepticism, the way you treat Cartesian skepticism, you give Kant Cartesian skepticism. This is what Kant wants you to do. First, turn it into Kantian skepticism. When you turn it into Kantian skepticism, then you can treat it. And once you've treated it in the Kantian form, you've killed it, and you're done. So you have some symptoms. You have these Cartesian symptoms. And what you have to do is you have to first make the patient really sick. You can't treat it. You can give him some more philosophical poison. Make him really sick. Once he's really sick, you can give him the cure, and then he's all right. That's the, if you will, the Kantian approach to skepticism. Kant doesn't get around to treating Cartesian skepticism until the end of the Transcendental Analytic. And then, even then, most people didn't see what he was doing. So he added the refutation of idealism. And he said, I'm just making explicit what was in the book all the time. In the refutation of idealism, he's treating what he calls problematic idealism. His word for what I'm calling Cartesian skepticism is problematic idealism. His word for what I'm calling Kantian skepticism is skepticism. This, I think, is often not appreciated. People think that what he means by skepticism is Cartesian skepticism, and that misses the entry point of the discussion. But you don't really need to worry about Cartesian skepticism in its own form. What you need to do is radicalize it, see what the deeper problem is. When you've addressed the deeper problem, you have the resources to then shut the Cartesian skeptic up. The Cartesian skeptic will not be able to formulate his problem. So we could say more about that. That's very generically the form of the Kantian treatment. Very generically, again, we'll say more about this on Wednesday. Wittgenstein, I think, thinks, in order to treat skepticism, you have to treat it at both ends. If we're just thinking about Cartesian and Kantian skepticism for the moment, then that means you have to both be concerned about the Cartesian form. That is, how we get into skepticism, what starts us, what takes us from a perfectly ordinary doubt about a spider, and whether Professor Conant knew there was a spider there, which is just a claim to knowledge about which he's wrong about something, fine. And a philosophical problem about knowledge, which, if I don't know this, I don't know anything. What's the character of that transition from what Wittgenstein would have called an ordinary or everyday doubt and a philosophical doubt? To get that straight, you have to worry about the topography of Cartesian skepticism. You have to really be able to recognize its forms and when it recurs and when it started. And so one thing I'll be doing next time is trying to get some of the topography of Cartesian skepticism clear. But in Wittgenstein, you also, I think, it's also important as part of the treatment to take the person and show them that once they start on this path, they will end in very deep trouble. So there's two Wittgenstein passages here which I think kind of nicely typify these two moments in Wittgenstein's thinking, which perhaps we could come back to on Wednesday. One passage is the passage where he says, what I do in philosophy is to lead words back from their metaphysical use to their everyday use. So if we think of this philosophical dialectic as a progression through stages, and we're inside a skeptical worry, then we can think of this movement in Wittgenstein as a movement back to the beginning. And that means we need to see how we entered, which means we have to understand the front end of the dialectic, if you will, what I was calling the Cartesian topography. But there's another moment in Wittgenstein, which is nicely, I think, summarized in a passage, this section 564 of the Investigations, where he said, my aim in philosophy is to lead you from, I guess a literal translation would be disguised nonsense to undisguised nonsense. Slightly less literal translation, I think it sounds much better in English, is to say, my aim in philosophy is to lead you from latent nonsense to patent nonsense. That's the movement in the other direction, the one that Kant, I think, first discovered, and which Wittgenstein also specialized in. But Wittgenstein, I think, thinks you need to do both of these things in order to have an adequate treatment. And it will be a topic on Wednesday why he thinks you need to do both. So in Wittgenstein, you'll find quite a bit of concern with both ends of this. Both trying to get you to recognize the Cartesian features, as I might put it, and also trying to turn problems into problems that develop Kantian features, showing you that where you are relieves that. And maybe one other thing I'll say about this, which is connected to the answer I was giving to Matteo's question, is Some of these philosophers I was mentioning before who I admire, like Cavell and Hyman and McDowell and Putnam, there are also philosophers who are very interested in Wittgenstein. And I would read what they said about Wittgenstein, and I would think this really seems to be right about something with Wittgenstein. Say I'd read some Cavell. And I'd read something by McDowell, and I'd look at the pages he's talking about, and I'd say, well, this really seems to be right about the pages of Wittgenstein. But then I would step back and I would look at Cavell and I would look at McDowell, and I thought, they seem really different from each other. These are really different philosophers, Cavell and McDowell. Very hard to mistake a page of Stanley Cavell for a page of John McDowell. How can they both be giving me Wittgenstein correctly, and it comes out so differently? And a kind of very simple-minded way to put this is too simple-minded, but we can do better on Wednesday. But for today, in answer to what I just told you, would be to say that Cavell is very focused on that first moment in Wittgenstein. He's interested in leading words back, and he's a master of this. And he's a master of the moments in Wittgenstein where Wittgenstein's doing that. And McDowell, I think, is very focused on the second moment in Wittgenstein. And he's very good at seeing how Wittgenstein's doing that. And he himself, I think, is a bit of a master of that. And neither is very sensitive to the other moment in Wittgenstein. And I think, frankly, neither is very good at the other thing. And so what you get are these two moments of Wittgenstein's practice sort of disconnected from the other in their writings. And so you wind up with sort of two pictures of what Wittgenstein's doing that are very different when they're practiced in isolation from each other. But in fact, I think both these things are going on in Wittgenstein. An interesting further remark in that connection is that, their relation to this topic. I mean, if you were asking not me, but them, your question. I think what Cavell would say, if he was listening to this, I sort of know this from experience, is he'd say, I don't see that this Kantian skepticism thing should be called skepticism. It just seems very confusing. I don't think that's what Kant was doing. Kant was worried about what I'm calling Cartesian skepticism. So all there is room for is the first movement. That if you think skepticism really is a self-contained Cartesian problem, the only way out of it is to go back, and it doesn't go somewhere. And then other minds is very special, very special. Has to do with features of being human. Whereas McDowell, if you listen to all of this, I don't know about now. I've had a chance to talk to McDowell a lot, so it's not quite a fair experiment. I've only had a chance to talk with Cavell about this a little bit, so I think McDowell's changed. But originally, the McDowell, when I first talked about this, so the McDowell whose writings we know, uncorrupted by Conant, I think his response is, in a sense, very Kantian. That is, what I described as Kant's method for treating skepticism is McDowell's. Structurally, that is. You take the Cartesian problem, or at least McDowell as of the late 80s, and throughout the 90s, and for instance in Mind and Will, which is 1994. What you do is you take the Cartesian problem and you turn it to the Kantian problem. And once you've turned it into the Kantian problem, you can treat it. And once you've treated that form, you're done. So in that sense, his practice, at least in those books and articles from the last 20 years, is a Kantian practice. So he, of course, does recognize both forms of skepticism. I think it's very hard to write as generally about Kantian skepticism as he does without seeing that there are two forms. And so I said something about there being these two varieties, he would agree with that. If I said something about their relationship, he would agree with that. But then when it came to the question of treatment, he would say, this is what we do. Kant was right about that. Only we can do it for many more variants than Kant realized. And it's important to see how they're connected. But as he puts it in the preface to Mind and World, I mean, this is my vocabulary stuck into his sentence. because he doesn't talk about Cartesian and Kantian varieties. But just with some substitutions, you can see him saying at the end of that preface, the second edition, the Cartesian variety of skepticism is an inchoate and inept expression of a deeper and more fundamental word, which is what I'm calling the Kantian word. So Cartesians are worried, for instance, in philosophy of perception about how can I know things are, as my senses perceive. McDowell shows you there's a deeper problem about empirical content, as he puts it. We solve this problem, and then the other problem just goes away. To that extent, I think he's unfaithful to something in Wittgenstein, at least up to that point, which is that that's not going to be sufficient. That's a necessary part of the treatment, but it's not by itself sufficient. So part of what I hope the larger story, if you put it all together, and then you turn it into a reading, and then you take it back to Wittgenstein, and then you look at other readings of Wittgenstein, is part of what I want to do is try to capture what I think is the truth in these various commentators, that we don't actually have to choose between them. But in order to capture the truth in each, we also need to see how there's a limitation to each, and we need to combine the truths in each in a larger reading of Wittgenstein practice. So that, in terms of how I think about this in connection with Wittgenstein, that would be the large story which I'm trying to tell, which you've anticipated. Perhaps we should adjourn for today. Thank you very much for coming. Am I supposed to turn this off? Sure. Sure. I've never seen an iPod with a microphone before. Yeah. See,
This one?
yeah, you just buy that and you can just